Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Perceive 2021. We are excited to have joining us today Amina El-Sharif, who is the Chief Innovation Officer and Chief Data Ethics Officer at Anno.ai. She will be speaking about creating an ethical data collection governance plan for AI and ML systems. So welcome, Amina, and we're really excited to have you today.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Claudia. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So as Claudia said, I'm Amina El-Sharif. I work at Anno.ai on innovation and data ethics in specific. I'm also president and head up a 501c6 organization, a non-for-profit called the Data Ethics Consortium for Security. We focus on data ethics issues as it relates to startups in the national security and law enforcement space. This summer, we had our first summer of research, is what we're calling it. And the topic that we were researching was specifically how to ethically collect data and or use third-party data sets for machine learning training use cases. So this is, applies to any company that might be in the data business, which if you're in the machine learning and AI business, you definitely are in the data business. And it specifically tackles how we can ethically gather data and then use it for those machine learning challenges. So overall, 4 sections that I'm going to be presenting on today very quickly. The first one covers general ethical data collection governance principles that we came up with during our research. Then we dive into 3 specific issues. The first one being responsible AI data collection principles. The second being responsible third-party data use. And then the third is the ethical data collection kind of framework that we came up with. So here are the general findings that we came up with through the whole process, looking at kind of a macro level. Most data governance plans used by companies do not cover the issue of machine learning and AI. So many data governance templates and research that's been done has been specifically on the subject of data governance plans for any data use, but not specifically a machine learning performance. So as a result, they don't directly address data issues as it relates to the machine learning development cycle, and we'll get into more of those specifics later. Our requirements for data collection in the national security space are unique, and therefore a lot of the data governance plans that are out there, or any plans that relate to machine learning and AI, don't necessarily fit the mold that we're looking for. Right, we run into classification and data sensitivity issues and challenges when it comes to performing ethical data collection and being able to engage legal counsel on those potentially classified contracts that we execute on. And in the machine learning space, in the federal space, we're finding that every machine learning and AI startup is a very data-centric business model, maybe more so than in the commercial space, where data really, really matters and really is a challenge, and every startup and or business is going to directly engage with that. We had to make a very conscious decision to balance legal delineations and then company identity and fabric, and this is mostly due to the fact that there aren't a whole lot of legal regulations and guidance out there as it pertains to data collection and third-party data use for machine learning algorithm development. And so as a result, there was a little bit of improvisation, for the lack of a better term, that we had to do to come up with this governance plan. There are lots of it depends scenarios, especially again, running into the national security space and law enforcement space, where there are some sensitivities around some of the use cases that we run into. And of course, we want to create a document that can stand this test of time. We understand that this document is going to be living to a certain extent, but what we didn't want to get into the business of is every time we have a use case, we have to go into this document and change something large. We wanted to come up with a governance document that can last out the time that we do research on it, so that employees have a framework to go back to again and again. And last but not least, legal counsel is essential. Right, so if anyone wants to come up with an ethical data governance plan, having legal counsel available is going to be crucial to success. So these are the responsible AI collection principles, again, on a macro level, that we decided and came up with and stuck to. And they're worded as such, very succinct, very, very simple in our document. We adopted the DoD JAIC AI ethics principles as our overall company ethical framework and fabric of being responsible, equitable, traceable, reliable, and governable. You can look at DoD AI JAIC documentation for more details on the breakdown of these principles, but that's what we decided to go ahead and adopt. We acknowledge that there are low risk versus high risk data sets, right? So again, kind of going back to that sensitivity levels, not only around classification, but also the collection of PII, that ultimately determines that we have some low risk use cases and data sets, and then we have some high risk ones, and they're going to be treated separately. Data scaling is a big challenge that is unique to machine learning algorithm development that we didn't find in other data governance plans that are out there available to the general public. We have to keep data sets current and updated. And you have to really watch your machine learning models after you launch them into production to make sure that you don't get concept drift, you don't get data scaling, and other challenges that we run into after machine learning models have been doing their job for an extended period of time over an ever-growing data corpus. Data set exploration reports is also something that we're requiring from our data science team. This isn't any specific format, but what it is a common step that data science teams engage in, which is called feature engineering. And so data set exploration and feature engineering kind of go together hand in hand. We ask that all of our data scientists conduct data exploration on a data set prior to using it for a machine learning model, ultimately to create that artifact to show what was found about the data set and its composition. But at the end of the day, to make sure we're doing our homework, that the data set actually suits the machine learning problem that we have at hand. Of course, elements of secure storage of data in rest and in transit are things that we're going to have to mention in this document, but we don't go into the nitty-gritty details of all the IT controls that go around those data sets. That is being saved for an overall larger data governance artifact that we'll work on probably later next year. And then finally, one of the principles that we instated is if PII is not required for the machine learning problem at hand, which at times it is for both commercial and government use cases, PII will be anonymized. We don't go into the nitty gritty on what anonymization techniques are going to be used, just because that will differ from data set to data set. But at the end of the day, we do set that as a principle that if PII isn't required, we're going to minimize it or we're not going to store it at all. These are the general ethical data collection principles, kind of continuing on from what we just talked about. Quality and appropriate data set use, right? That goes back to the data set exploration study. We want to make sure that the data sets we have are appropriate for the machine learning model problem at hand. We acknowledge that there's classification sensitivity around a lot of data collection events. I'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the talk. And then finally, PII. PII is a huge deal for any company that handles data. Firstly, we define it. We directly took that definition out of GDPR definitions of what PII is. We state that we want to minimize its collection and retention whenever possible, anonymize it when we don't need to use it for the machine learning task at hand, record it whenever it's collected or used so that we have that kind of traceable paper trail whenever we do collect PII, implement security controls to protect its storage both in transit and at rest. And then finally, retention policies around PII, which stay general. It's generally going to say at when you don't need the PII anymore or when you don't need that data set anymore, purge it. At the end of the day, we wanted to enable collection whenever we possibly could. We didn't want this document to be a obstacle or standing between us and trying to engage on business that the company is trying to get done and other startups are trying to get done. This is a huge deal, especially for early stage startups. You don't want to implement any ethical AI controls if it's going to necessarily stand or fully block any type of business opportunity that you have, understanding that there might be some business opportunities that the company chooses not to engage on due to those ethical concerns. We mandate that we follow legal guidance, right? So if our lawyer says something, we need to go with that and stick with what his answer may be. And then finally, we establish an AI ethics council within the company that's going to meet on, at a minimum, a monthly basis to look at data collection events and or third-party data sets that we'd like to use meet on them and come up with top-down decision-making on whether we're going to engage in those data collection events and or use those third-party data sets. So in using third-party data sets are basically any data sets that are not data sets that we collect ourselves or are given to us by a customer. So these are, Kaggle data sets, open source data sets out there for purchase, data sets on marketplaces. These are what we kind of collectively call third-party data sets. We do have some very specific guidance around this that's kind of not fungible, for the lack of a better way to put it. Limiting training data sets to public domain or with licenses that are available for commercial use and modification, like CCO and CC BY licenses. We want to stay away from GPL type licenses or non-commercial restriction license use or share alike copyleft licenses, right? So these are very clearly stated on most of these data sets, what the licensing and copyright regulations are around that data set use. And last but not least, we want to make sure we record whenever we do use third-party data sets. So make sure that there's some kind of paper trail written down somewhere that indicates when we use third-party data sets to solve a machine learning problem. This is just a sample submission process, right? So whenever the data science team or any other team wants to engage on using a third-party data set, these are the data points that we ask them to provide our team, our data ethics counsel, one to either leave a paper trail or two for approvals if there are any doubts or kind of questions around that third-party data set that they would like to use. Now moving on to data collection. We define data collection to be any type of going out and collecting event that the company performs itself, right? So this is not data given to us. This isn't data bought. This is data that we're going out and collecting ourselves with our own hardware and sensors. A lot of AI and applied machine learning companies and startups in the federal space are forced to do this due to a number of reasons. Some might be that those data sets to solve the machine learning problem are just not readily available. The customer doesn't have them. Another common problem that we've seen is that customer data sets might be available, but they are sparse. So they need to be augmented with additional collect. And then last, customers may have data sets available, but the data set quality is not adequate or it's significantly degraded and cannot be used for machine learning systems. So again, some kind of repeated principles here that we've seen before. All data collection events will be recorded, both classified and unclassified, of course, without compromising any national security information. We do make an explicit statement in our data governance plan that we do trust our employees to make judgment calls on data collection events. We have to be able to trust our own employees to make these calls as it's referenced in our kind of ethical fabric as a company. This is partially why we hire them, right? Because we believe that they're good people that are going to make good decisions. So we want to make sure that we iterate that to our employees. We do have a clause that specifically tackles classified and sensitive data collection events. Like I said, still needs to be recorded, provide whatever information you can on unclassified level without divulging classified information. And then specifically when it comes to where the data collection is going to occur, we understand that like country or city level information might be considered sensitive and or classified in of itself. So we ask for at a minimum what we're calling continent information. But this is really a region information. Is it EMEA? Is it North Africa? Is it Europe? And then we run into GDPR concerns. That's why we need at a minimum that kind of continent level, is so that we understand what kind of data rights and regulations that we need to be looking at from a legal perspective on a regional level. Consent and notification are specifically addressed in the document. These are two things that GDPR harps on quite a bit, but have also kind of made the news headlines recently, right? We need to make sure that we do obtain consent where it is appropriate and or post notification where it's appropriate. And I'll get into the more details on that later on. We acknowledge that laws vary in public places from state to state. So this basically just means if we want to collect data in public places where privacy is presumed to not be preserved because you are in a public place, laws around these public places and data collected there does vary state by state. So we that's where we get into the case basis, right? Where we have to treat different collection events that happen in different states differently. Again, document collection use cases, whenever we do perform collect in public places, that's considered a lot more sensitive than, for example, doing collection in our own training facility or collection in a customer training facility where consent and agreement is explicitly given or presumed to be given in the contract when that's drawn up. And then, of course, what we're working on doing to try to lighten the load, if you will, is establish a baseline for each state that we want to perform collection in. So get a common understanding amongst all the stakeholders at the company of what is generally allowed in the state of Virginia, for example, or the District of Columbia, or Texas, or wherever else we're going to be collecting, so that these use cases, when they do come up, become repeatable, and we don't necessarily have to hit our legal counsel for every single use case that we run into state by state. If collection occurs in private locations with partners, and a written agreement needs to be in place, right? So something written down somewhere needs to allow or give the company permission to collect data on those premises and or on those private individuals. Data points that are submitted for these collection events. So this could be as specific as, I want a Bluetooth MAC ID for my TPMS collection. And or in my computer vision task, I want to be able to do object detection on types of cars. It needs to be that specific in terms of what data points are planned to be collected for each event. And only those data points are allowed to be collected. So for example, if I have a sensor stack and I just specifically want a Bluetooth MAC address, if that sensor happens to collect other data that I discover after the fact was collected, that data cannot be stored and retained, because I only got approval for that specific MAC address that may or may not be categorized as PII. And of course, on the subject of PII, we reiterate the importance of coming up with a plan for protection, anonymization, and storage. And these plans are required to be submitted to the data science team and engineering teams for review. So it doesn't necessarily mean that those plans have to be submitted to the AI ethics council for review, but someone on the technical end of the data science team and the engineering team needs to take a look at what your plan is, and that plan needs to be written down somewhere and readily available in case the company might need it. What you see on the bottom of this slide is a sample data collection submission tracker that we came up with. These are the data points that we're asking our teams to fill out whenever they do have a data collection event that they'd like to submit to the AI Ethics Council. Okay. Last but not least, this is just a sample data collection permission letter. This was written up in conjunction with our legal counsel as a sample agreement that you could have in place with another company if this is something that you would like to do to implement as, again, additional protection and controls for your own protection when you do execute on contracts. And the one slide that didn't load on here that I'll go back to, what we did come up with was a data collection plan that is shows order of preference of what we would prefer data collection events to kind of follow. An example of this use case might be in the flow chart that I had submitted. All US collection events were on the right side, and then all of the international collection events were on the left. If we do any international collection, those events automatically have to go directly to legal review. We don't allow our employees or anyone at Anno to just go ahead and execute on those international data collection events, simply because there are a lot of if-and buts associated with international collect depending on where it's happening. And we don't really have a track record of repeated use cases established as a baseline yet for that. On the US side, the first order of preference that we usually like to see in data collection events is that it happens on our facility, our training facility in Reston, Virginia, with our own employees. And the reason being is this consent is very easy to obtain, right? So if it's happening on facilities that we own, we don't have to obtain permission to collect the public or collect in another private location. And if it involves our employees, we can simply have them sign consent to monitor statements that we do have available internally, and they can go ahead and perform whatever collection they need to with our own sensors on our own facility. The next prioritized or preferred way to conduct data collection events would be any combination of our employees on a partner facility or compound and or their employees, so the customer and or partner's employees on their facility. For private locations, this makes things quite easy, just because we can go directly to whoever owns that private location, come up with a written agreement for data collection, and then go ahead and execute as we need to. And then whoever's involved in that collection can be kind of up for whatever agreements we put together. We've had situations where we've had Anno employees mixed with those contractors and other customer individuals perform collect. And then we've also had just anyone who is in that private location facility as part of the collection event. The implied there is that the customer or whoever we're doing the collection event at, wherever that location is, will post signage and or will notify people that collection is happening prior to that collection occurring. If that doesn't happen and someone finds out about it and decides to sue or decides to take legal action, what we can do is go back and say, hey, we have this written agreement with the customer that places that responsibility essentially on them because we performed that training and that collection event on their facility. So that's another way that our startups and our companies can kind of protect themselves and perform data collection very easily. All the other use cases that stem after that become more complicated. So we do have use cases where we have data collection that happens in public areas, all around cities, maybe coffee shops, other places. Those for now are going directly under legal review every time, just because, again, we don't have an established baseline and it can vary from state to state or even sometimes from city to city or county to county. So for right now, all of those public, anything that involves the public is going to have to go under legal review and be approved. Now, we do have some sticky wicket use cases, I guess you could call them, that are kind of on the fence, where we might have sensor stacks that are established or set up in a private location. So let's say a defensive driving training facility, we have cameras that are set up at the entrances. However, those cameras point out to what's considered public property or the street that's right in front of it. At that point, you run into a few issues just because, yes, the sensors do actually physically reside on public property or on private property, so that protects you. But there is incidental collect that could potentially happen on the public, and you have to treat that. You cannot ignore that. You do have to deal with that as it relates to any local laws that might govern the ability for someone to go out and perform collection on the general public. So those use cases or those edge use cases are something that we still haven't established a baseline for, but those are the use cases that we're kind of trying to get to the point where we have an established baseline so that we can come up with a very easy decision-making process right off the bat. So those cover all the different kind of principles and findings that we came up with. Again, kind of going over third-party data sets and then data collection events that we wanted to ourselves perform. The Data Ethics Consortium for Security is going to meet at the end of the month, where other startups are going to be able to present on their findings, whether they did research with their own legal counsel or they did research internally at their teams to directly tackle their own data collection use cases and scenarios. So this plan and template may vary depending on what startups find and also kind of based on what their mission is, right? So at Anno, we primarily deal with computer vision. We do have some other multi-modal sensor collection that we do. If a company is primarily conducting data collection online because they have natural language processing use cases and they'd like to use, for example, social media data, that's going to look very, very different compared to maybe the principles that we come up with. So it'll be an exciting time to see what other startups do present at that consortium meeting at the end of the month. And hopefully we can come up with a good kind of baseline to publish to our startups at the Data Ethics Consortium for Security. That's all I've got today, Claudia.
Thank you so much, Amina. It's really important for companies to practice ethical data collection, and I believe your insights were extremely valuable to the audience. So thank you. Thank you again for participating. A big round of applause from our virtual audience, and we will see you at our next session.